Hello and welcome to the Say It Sheffield's LGBT plus domestic abuse online webinar. I'm Evie, I use she, her pronouns, and I will be taking you through this webinar today. This webinar is aimed particularly at South Yorkshire professionals who support survivors of domestic abuse and sexual violence, but it will be helpful for any professional who wants to develop their understanding of making their services and their practice more LGBT inclusive. We hope as a result you will walk away inspired to take some actions. This webinar is the third in a series of webinars produced by Say It. If you haven't watched our LGBT Identities 101 and LGBT plus inclusion webinars, they may be a good place to start. We have designed this webinar to be interactive with opportunities to pause it and answer questions, watch film clips, etc. We recommend it would be good to give yourself at least 2 hours to be able to cover all the content. Feel free to do this in 2 one-hour slots if you prefer. So, what will you need? You'll need a pen and paper, so pause this and go grab one if you haven't got one already. Watch this in a comfy place, take a break, have a drink, look outside. Staring at a screen constantly isn't a great way to learn. Before we get going, we want to explicitly say we welcome feedback about this webinar. We recognise that you might not feel it is reflective of the great diversity of LGBT experiences. Please feel free to get in touch and be part of helping make this webinar better. So, what do we hope you'll learn from this webinar? The focus of this session is about introducing you to LGBT plus experiences of abuse, the barriers LGBT plus people face in accessing support from mainstream services, and ways in which you can ensure your practice is more LGBT plus inclusive. In reality, this webinar is just a whistle-stop tour of topics and issues which you may want to go away and build a greater understanding of. We also recognise that inclusion is a process rather than something you can just tick off. It's a process of thinking, having discussions with co-workers, taking action, practicing new things, and a bit more thinking. What we aim to do in this session is to inspire you to engage with this process and give you some ideas of practical stating points. So, we will cover what might be stopping LGBT plus survivors getting support, how might experiences of domestic abuse differ for LGBT plus people, how can we improve our support for LGBT plus survivors, and how can we embed this learning into our practice? So, let's get started. For our first activity, I'd like you to pause this training and take a second to think of a domestic abuse survivor. Don't overthink it. Okay, go. I wonder, what was their age, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and class? Was there any physical characteristics that indicate that they are a victim? Are they bruised, for example? Cowering? Do they look weak or vulnerable? I wonder, was the survivor you imagined a white, cisgender, heterosexual woman, aged in their mid-20s or early 30s? Did you imagine them to be heterosexual with a male perpetrator? If the answer to any of these questions was yes, that's okay. The reason I ask this is not to catch you out, but is to offer some immediate self-reflection. We are all, you see, impacted by what is known as the public story of domestic abuse. This public story is rooted in the legacy of first and second wave feminism, which was really successful in transforming domestic abuse from a private problem into a serious public problem. However, there were some unintended consequences of this. The public story is largely only seen through the lens of white, cisnormative and heteronormative narratives, and is often regurgitated by the imagery we will see in the press, on our TV screens, and even on adverts for domestic abuse and sexual violence services. These will often depict white, cisgender, female survivors in vulnerable, cowering positions. Consciously or not, we will absorb these images, and the public story becomes normalised in our narratives of abuse. This, however, wrongly tells us that domestic abuse is only perpetrated by heterosexual men against heterosexual women, always physical violence, and a problem of a particular presentation of gender. For example, a bigger, stronger man victimising the smaller, weaker woman. This creates what is known as the construct of the ideal victim. Anyone who falls outside of this construct is seen to deviate from the norm and is therefore harder to believe, understand, and support. The ideal victim maintains societal assumptions that victims do not fight back, they do not use violence, retaliate, or take revenge. Nothing in their behaviour or demeanour can be implicated in their victimisation. They are passive, weak, overpowered mentally and physically. They are cisgender, female, and white, and they never leave and always go back. These form biases that we all internalise, and identifying them, naming them, and then working to undo them is very important. But what happens when you are able to recognise your experiences as abusive and you are looking for support? We know that LGBT+ survivors are less likely to seek help from services and would like you to consider why this might be the case. We now invite you to pause the webinar again and write down 5 reasons why you think LGBT+ survivors may not seek support from services or the police. Maybe your answers look similar to this, or maybe your list had other suggestions. Here we have offered a non-exhaustive list of individual barriers LGBT+ survivors may face when accessing support. These barriers are particularly compounded if you are a survivor with multiple intersecting identities. You may be a member of the LGBT community and a person of colour, for example. These barriers may include having had previous bad experiences of racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and other biases within services. Feeling pressure for your relationship to be a positive representation of your community. Having a lack of faith in police due to historic and ongoing persecution your community have faced. Concerns about disclosing sexual orientation or gender identity due to a fear around safety and confidentiality, and this is particularly present if you are not out in all or some settings. Accessing support could also present an immigration risk with threats to your spousal visa or deportation. There could be a fear of being criminalised yourself, particularly if drug taking was present in your experience of domestic abuse or sexual violence. You may fear accessing support from mainstream services who are not yet inclusive enough of LGBT identities, and similarly, you may recognise that specialist services aren't specialist enough and only hold single specialisms, meaning that survivors have to choose which identity is more relevant. All of these barriers lead to a fear of re-victimisation by the services designed to offer support. For our next activity, I'd like you to watch this 5-minute video. In it, actors depict a real-life story of an experience of abuse. As you're watching, I'd like you to take note of your thoughts and perceptions throughout. Who do you think is the perpetrator and who do you think is the survivor? Does your opinion of this change as the video progresses? And what different types of abuse did you notice?
Lock the door.
It must have been a mistake.
I couldn't get out.
Then you should have rang me.
I did.
You didn't ring me.
I did.
Nothing.
You knocked me in.
Don't be stupid. Why would I do that?
I don't know. Why did you?
Paranoid.
The door was locked.
I must have took the key by mistake.
So why didn't you come back to see where I was?
I thought you had another one of your headaches.
So you just stayed out?
Yeah, I stayed out.
It's supposed to be a fresh start.
What's that supposed to mean?
Where did you go?
Out!
Where?
Oh, you Joe, why don't you have another one of your tablets? 2, maybe 3.
Been out all night.
So?
So I'm just asking where you've been.
I've been out with Carrie and Claire.
All night?
No, not all night.
So what were you doing?
Oh, will you just shut up?
What do you expect me to think?
I expect you to shut up when I tell you to.
Why are you being like this?
I'm not being like anything.
Here you are on the train before.
Oh, do you know what? You've got serious problems.
I can't do this.
It's all in your fucking fat head.
I mean it, Sammy.
I mean, Sammy.
I can't do this.
What are you doing?
I can't be here.
Where do you think you're going?
Anywhere!
Keep your voice down.
Sammy, don't.
Shut up.
Sammy, please.
Didn't I tell you to just shut up?
You're hurting me.
Shh. Now the wall's the only thing, and everyone can hear you making a show of yourself. And me.
I'm sorry.
Good.
Where are you going?
He'll carry some money.
I'll come with you.
Do you need to?
I'm not saying you.
Yes, you are. Look here. You look a mess.
Sammy, don't do this.
It's your own fault.
No, it's my fault, and I've said it's my fault, Sammy.
You just stop.
I want this.
Yeah, neither do I.
Fine. Fuck off then. Let's finish. Fresh start, my ass. I should have known it was a load of crap. You haven't changed. You do what you always do, walk out. Sammy does what suits Sammy. Don't give a fuck about me. You know what? I don't care, because I've had enough. As soon as we get back, you can get out of my house. Okay, if you've got nowhere else to stay. It's not my problem. I don't care what everyone else thinks, that I'm bad. They think what they want. I don't care if it means I can't ever go out seen again, because according to you, I'm not a real lesbian anyway. So what does it matter? I don't care if my mum hammers me into the ground with 100 I told you so's. All you had to do was just said sorry. Then everything would be okay. But no. Not Sammy. Because she's right and I'm wrong. And that's the way it works. Don't matter that we're locked in here all night. Say I'm sorry all the time. Even when I don't think it's me. Say I'm sorry. Because I am. don't want to hurt you. And I know I do. I'm not perfect. Get jealous. I know you hate that because what your last girlfriend was like. And I'm not meaning to be like her. It's just work for days at a time. Mine just works overtime.
Here are some common things people have shared that they have noticed. Did you notice them too? How our initial perception is often that the black, masculine, presenting person is the perpetrator. Why do you think this is? We have often internalised these tropes and stereotypes, which tell us that black women are strong, independent, angry and sassy, and therefore are either more threatening and inherently violent, and that white women are more vulnerable, weak, and less capable of causing harm. What about the presentations of gender? Did you notice that we associate more masculine presentations with being the aggressor, and more feminine presentations as being more vulnerable? Another point of interest is the ways in which types of abuse, such as emotional abuse, gaslighting, and identity abuse, are experienced along gendered and sexuality lines. People notice, for example, how the pressures from family members to present their relationship as a good LGBT relationship could deter a survivor from reporting. And finally, how the fear of losing a sense of safety in the LGBT plus community could also lead survivors to feeling trapped to remain in an abusive relationship. Take a moment to consider, if this couple were to present themselves at a healthcare service or housing service, for example, do you think a practitioner would have been able to identify the abuse, or even to think and consider that abuse could be present in this relationship? And what may be the consequences of these oversights for a survivor? For our next activity, we invite you to examine this case study with us. This case study comes with a trigger warning. This domestic homicide review is useful as it brings together some awareness of LGBT plus lives, some of the barriers to LGBT plus survivors accessing support, and raises some of the issues around asking questions about gender identity and sexual orientation. The following events all happened within one day and follow the victim, Mr. C, who was in their mid-60s and suffered from problematic alcohol use. They moved to Brighton a few years before so they could be more openly gay. Their partner, Mr. Y, was in their mid-30s and abused him emotionally, financially and physically. Prior to this incident, the GP had seen the victim, Mr. C, for a series of falls, slips and accidents. On this particular day, Mr. C collapsed in a shop. The first aider rang for an ambulance and the staff noticed some injuries and asked about them. A staff member remembers Mr. C saying, "I have been assaulted by my boyfriend," but the staff member only passed on information about the assault to the ambulance crew, as they decided that the abuse from my boyfriend was too personal to put on an accident form. The ambulance arrived and took Mr. C to A&E. The crew member remembers him saying, "I had a fight with my boyfriend this morning, but he told them that it was fine and he didn't want anything doing about it." The ambulance crew recorded it as assault, but not that the boyfriend was the perpetrator. When Mr. C arrived at A&E, the perpetrator was already there and posed as the carer. Mr. C disclosed, "He beats me up," but Mr. C said, "You know I don't." The nurse did not include this in the notes and said this was because Mr. Y seemed very caring and Mr. C did not seem anxious around him. The nurse said they did not know if this disclosure was true. Mr. Y was interpreted as the carer as he was a younger male with a caring manner. As a result, Mr. C was not examined and the notes recorded said he fell while shopping. It's important to note here that at this stage, Mr. C had disclosed abuse in front of the perpetrator, something we know is likely to lead to a huge increase in risk. Mr. C waited 2 hours to see a doctor in the minor injuries unit because it was not treated as an urgent case. By the time the doctor called Mr. C, he wasn't there and had gone home. That night, Mr. C was killed by Mr. Y at home. In the DHR, the following learning was noted. It recognised the discomfort with this disclosure amongst numerous practitioners. It identified how a young male partner to an older man did not fit this public story of domestic abuse, and how Mr. Y manipulated this heteronormativity to appear as the carer. It was also noted that due to it being especially hard for LGBT+ survivors to disclose abuse, professionals must listen. Please pause now and consider this case. What do you think went wrong and why? Slide 11. These failings across the domestic abuse and sexual violence sector are now being talked about more and more within the mainstream media, with whistleblowers recognising how structural barriers at the organisational and institutional level cause major harm to some of the most vulnerable service users. In a recent investigation conducted by journalists at Galop, for example, they exposed the institutional transphobia within the domestic abuse and sexual violence sector. Transmisogyny goes against the fundamental principles of sexual violence workers, that you must believe survivors. It's fascinating and horrific that this bedrock of services is thrown out the window immediately, said a Galop interviewee from a sexual violence service. Similarly, institutional racism is being called out across the sector too. One of the many notable cases includes that of Solace Women's Aid, whose black staff members unionise against racism perpetrated by upper management. They called for the CEO and other senior managers to resign in order for the culture of racism to be addressed. On a daily basis, we are supporting women of colour who face systemic and systematic discrimination within institutions. We are committed to fighting racism wherever we come across it, including from within Solace. Say Solace Women's Aid's open letter, written by staff to CEOs and senior staff. In the next part of the session, we'll be looking at LGBT+ experiences of domestic abuse and how they may differ. Feel free to pause at this point, have a cuppa and rejoin for part 2. Welcome back. The focus of this part of the session is all about LGBT+ experiences of domestic abuse, how they may differ, and what risks might be at play. It's important to note that whilst LGBT+ experiences of domestic abuse may differ, the tactics used to gain power and control, such as physical, sexual, emotional and financial abuse, are the same in LGBT relationships as they are in cisgender, heterosexual relationships. Abusers in LGBT+ relationships, however, also reinforce these tactics with societal factors that compound the complexity a survivor faces in leaving or getting support. These can include homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, cisnormativity, racism, xenophobia, and more. In this next section, we will look at 8 experiences of abuse which LGBT+ survivors may experience. Often, a survivor may experience multiple forms of these abuses at once or during the course of their relationship. They may also experience a number of these by different people, their intimate partner, family members, or the wider community, for example. The information provided here is non-extensive. It's an introduction into these areas, and we invite you to explore the resources provided here if you are interested in deepening your understanding of LGBT+ experiences of abuse. The first way that LGBT+ survivors experience abuse differently is via the unique way that identity as an LGBT person, be it sexuality or gender identity, is manipulated, controlled, and exploited. This could range from not only being allowed to identify as your sexuality and gender, and having this enforced in a number of ways, including conversion therapy or microaggressions associated with bi-erasure, to using threats of outing, where you disclose a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or HIV status without their consent as a form of control. It can also include forcing people back into the closet, so to speak, and either explicitly or not forcing someone to hide their identity in certain settings. We know that there is a common pressure for LGBT+ people to want to protect the image of LGBT+ relationships due to the often biased assumptions that exist in society. This can be manipulated so that an abuser knows they can get away with the abuse because of the stigma attached to coming forward as an LGBT+ survivor. The abusers may also use their own privilege or ability to pass to undermine a survivor and use the system against them. Think back to the Fresh Start video and how our assumptions on ethnicity and gender presentation could be used as a tool of control. And finally, policing your gender expression, telling you don't look or act gay, bi, or trans enough, and making you feel like you don't belong in the LGBT community can also be a type of identity abuse. This is particularly prominent in LGBT people of colour, where 51% of which have experienced discrimination within the LGBT+ community. Now pause this slide and check out some of these helpful resources about identity abuse. A person's age is also something which can be used as a tool of abuse, particularly for young people and older people in their first LGBT+ relationships. Inexperience and naivety can be seen as a vulnerability to be manipulated by abusers. We know that LGBT+ people under the age of 24 are less likely to access domestic abuse services than older groups. Similarly, older generations are especially reluctant to seek help from the police due to the legacy of institutionalised violence against the LGBT+ community. Additional vulnerabilities include the lack of accurate info on healthy LGBT+ relationships, the hypersexualisation of LGBT+ lifestyles, the public story of child sexual exploitation and domestic abuse, which does not include LGBT people, the experiences of family homophobia and transphobia, which normalises abuse, having no one to confide in, such as peers or family, for fear of the reaction they might receive, the need and desire for LGBT+ relationships to be positive. There may be an element of secrecy, such as making contact online or alone in bars. This can lead to potential vulnerabilities to exploitation, such as an abuser being able to exploit the lack of knowledge and experience, making abuse seem like a normal part of same-sex relationships, saying things like, if you were a real lesbian, you'd do X, or women can't abuse women, or men can't abuse men. And there are particular vulnerabilities for online abuse. Specific apps such as Grindr, Scruff may be difficult to manage, particularly when looking at safety, monitoring whereabouts, and they often present as another space to perpetrate abuse. Apps can be a healthy and happy addition to dating or casual sex, and have helped many people improve their confidence around dating and chatting up people they fancy. Some users report easier access to potential partners who prefer specific physical attributes, sexual practices, or social interests, for example. However, just like the dating in the real world, virtual dating online and on apps can carry some personal safety risks or be a target for hate crime. Here are some helpful resources about first relationships. Feel free to pause this slide and check them out. LGBT plus survivors may also experience abuse perpetrated by family members who hold prejudices and discrimination. Not only does this put survivors at risk within the family home, but it also means that if they experience further abuse within an intimate partner relationship, then they do not have a family which is a safe space to access support. This is more common than you may realise. Over a quarter of parents said they wouldn't feel proud if their child came out. 1 in 10 parents in Britain would feel uncomfortable living at home with their child if they came out as LGBT+. Over 1 in 10 would not want their child to bring home a same-sex partner. 1 in 5 would worry about how family members would respond to them having an LGBT+ child. And 1 in 3 said they would not be willing to use their child's pronouns if they came out as transgender. Here we have a case study from Calm Nirvana. Amar called for support, explaining that he was gay and his family were not accepting of his sexuality. They were pressuring him to marry and had made him have exorcisms to cure him of being gay. He was controlled by his family and wasn't allowed to go out, socialise, etc. He had also spoken about having long hair and being made to shave it off by his family as a means of control and reinforcing that they didn't approve of his sexuality. He felt the abuse had become somewhat normal and he had been subject to honour-based abuse for a long time. There is a direct correlation between LGBT plus experiences of family abuse and the rates of homelessness of LGBT plus people. In the UK, for example, a quarter of young people facing homelessness identify as LGBT. Only 13% of LGBT plus young people felt supported by parents or step-parents whilst homeless. 1 in 6, 16%, of LGBT young people were forced to do sexual acts against their will by family members before they became homeless. 2/3, 61%, of LGBT young people felt frightened or threatened by their family members before they became homeless. And 50% of LGBT young people said they feared that expressing their LGBT identity to family members would lead to them being evicted. Pause this slide and read this research on LGBT plus homelessness to learn more. Cultural abuse is defined as the means by which a perpetrator can exercise dominance, control, or coercion over a victim using cultural, spiritual, or religious beliefs. Cultural abuse is often, but not always, linked to family abuse. Whilst family members can be the perpetrators of cultural abuse, so can faith organisations, members of the community, close family friends, intimate partners, the LGBT plus community itself, and so on. It's important to recognise, however, that non-Western cultures aren't inherently transphobic or homophobic. In fact, some cultures have celebrated what we now understand as LGBT plus identities for centuries, and many argue that it is colonialism and imperialism which has been foundational in creating the current oppressions we see today. For example, ancient Egyptian texts often depict a third gender, also known as Sekhets, who were depicted in hieroglyphics and are thought to have represented either gay men, non-binary people, or transgender people. Two-spirit people have existed since the 16th century in Native America, and there are up to 5 genders recognised in the Bisu community of Indonesia. Cultural abuse has many foundations. LGBT plus identities and lifestyles are still criminalised in 72 countries around the world. Religious texts are often interpreted in ways which permit homophobia and transphobia. Intersections between homophobia, transphobia, racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia and xenophobia create the foundations for cultural abuse. And 51% of BME people experience racial discrimination within their LGBT communities, meaning that cultural abuse can happen within cultures also. This presents a multitude of risks for survivors. These include honour-based violence, forced marriage within a heterosexual relationship, family abuse and intimate partner abuse, wider community abuse, identity suppression, threats of outing, conversion therapy, corrective rape, social exclusion and marginalisation, being failed by services and additional barriers to support, and hate crimes. Now, pause this slide and access these resources. We recommend watching this video and listening to this podcast series in order to enhance your understanding of cultural abuse. A person's immigration status can be used as a tool of abuse at both the institutional and individual levels. Institutionally, we know that across 72 countries in the world, LGBT plus identities and lifestyles continue to be criminalised. This can lead to LGBT plus people fleeing persecution in their home countries and seeking asylum in places like the UK, which is a human right. A 2014 inquiry into the detention of refugee women found that 52% of women detained in Yarlswood Detention Centre said they had been fleeing gender-based persecution. 18% said they had fled persecution because they identify as lesbian. If a person is a trafficking victim and is in the NRM, the National Referral Mechanism, their LGBT plus identity may help them secure indefinite leave to remain, as they will be unable to return to their home country for fear of persecution and therefore must be granted asylum. A survivor of domestic abuse with insecure immigration status, who is experiencing domestic abuse at the individual level, however, may have their immigration status manipulated as a tool of control. This could include threatening to report their status to the authorities or forcing someone to remain in an unsafe relationship in order to maintain their immigration status. We also know that the threat of being deported back to countries which are hostile to LGBT plus people often prevents people reporting their abuse or trusting the authorities. We now invite you to pause this slide and check out some helpful resources about immigration abuse. Here are some national and local South Yorkshire-based organisations that can support you and your clients around immigration abuse. There are many ways in which sexual abuse can be experienced by LGBT plus survivors. Today we are going to introduce you to 3 tools of abuse which may be familiar to some and unfamiliar to others. The first is chemsex, often known as slamming. Chemsex or slamming describes sexual activity under the influence of drugs. In some gay and bisexual male communities, there is a chemsex scene with organised parties. This is not to judge those who participate in these scenes, but it is worth recognising that these scenes can present situations where power and control are more easily misused. Secondly, corrective rape. Corrective rape, also known as curative or homophobic rape, is a hate crime in which one or more people are raped because of their perceived sexual orientation or gender identity. The common intended consequence of the rape is to turn the person heterosexual or to enforce conformity with gender stereotypes. Corrective rape is recognised as a type of conversion therapy, which more broadly is not yet decriminalised in the UK. And finally, HIV and AIDS. Though it's important not to stigmatise those with HIV and AIDS, it's important to recognise the ways that HIV status can be used as a tool of abuse. for example, by the increased risk of HIV transmission through forced unprotected sex, the intentional exposing of the partner to HIV and/or other STIs, threatening to disclose the HIV status of a partner, or using their own HIV status as a form of manipulation. We recommend pausing this slide and accessing these helpful resources about LGBT+ experiences of sexual abuse. It's vital that we recognise transgender people's experiences of domestic abuse. Transphobic harassment is experienced routinely in people's day-to-day lives. To have this also from a partner, ex-partner or family member compounds a sense of worthlessness, and we see high levels of suicide attempts linked to people's reactions to their gender identity as a result. Here are some quotes by trans survivors to illustrate the ways that transphobia is used as a tool of abuse. My partner used to transition as a means of controlling me. They threatened to burn all my paperwork from the Gender Identity Service if I didn't come home at an agreed time. I had to keep my paperwork with me when I left the house. It got so bad that I couldn't live there anymore. And that quote was from a white trans man in their mid-30s from Doncaster. My partner told me, "No one else sees you as a woman. I fuck you like a woman, so be happy for what you have got." And that was from a white trans woman in their mid-40s from Doncaster. Here are some helpful resources about trans experiences of abuse. Please pause this slide and check them out. This next part of the session will focus on improving our support for LGBT+ survivors. Here, we will offer some resources which may be beneficial for your practice. The first resource in question is the LGBT+ Special Considerations Risk Assessment. The LGBT+ risk assessment was made in recognition of the ways that the DASH risk assessment fails to identify specific risks pertaining to LGBT+ abusive relationships. This is largely because it asks questions that reflect the public story of cisgender heterosexual relationships. It is recommended that you use the LGBT+ risk assessment alongside the DASH and submit it to MARAC in support of your case. Here are the questions included in the LGBT+ Special Considerations Risk Assessment. As you can see, there are an additional 17 questions to consider here which draw out additional vulnerabilities, risks and needs of LGBT+ survivors. The LGBT+ risk assessment is a useful tool to familiarise yourself with and embed in our practice, because often, in the buzz of support work, these questions will slip our minds during referral processes and support meetings. We are now going to watch a film about a transgender woman's experience of domestic abuse. After watching, we invite you to try out completing the LGBT+ risk assessment for the victim and survivor portrayed in the film. forgotten out the bins again. Yours is outside in number 26.
Oh. Thanks.
No work today?
Well, I should be so lucky. Got a safeguarding conference at 11.
Isn't it the wedding tomorrow?
Yeah.
You taking the dog?
No, Michael's looking after him.
Where is he?
In bed?
The dog?
No, Michael. The dog's in his crate sleeping.
How's he doing?
Still biting, but I'm not going to let the little shit win the battle.
I met Michael.
Much the same.
You're a better woman than me, Jude, if I tell you that. I don't know many women that will put up with it.
He's not well. That's the way I look at it. If he's not well, then he'll get better.
Didn't you want to go to the wedding?
I don't want him to go. I've got the kids to think about.
Of course you have.
You didn't change the name on the card.
No, I didn't.
My name's Michaela.
Your birth certificate says Michael. Can you give the house a once over?
Of course.
I don't want to come back on Sunday and find the place a pigsty.
It won't be.
Can you go through it, Michael? Top to bottom. I'm sick of looking at the dust. And I can't be expected to do housework and go out to work as well. Will you pay that bill? It's been there for a week. Make sure you put him out in the yard. Oh, and if it rains, get the washing in.
Why did you do that?
Well, your clothes.
Judith, please.
You just made love to me.
I don't want to upset you.
But you are upsetting me, Michael. You're upsetting me and you're upsetting the kids. Have you any idea what this is doing to me? To them?
I'm sorry.
If you really cared about us, you'd put a stop to all this right now.
I can't.
If you loved me, you'd phone the doctor and you'd tell him you'd made a mistake.
It's not about you.
Oh yes, it is, Michael. It's about me and the kids. You're their dad.
I don't want to hurt them.
They're ashamed of you. Is that what you want? You're bringing shame on this whole family. And it's not just me and the kids. Your poor mum and dad.
I'm sorry.
I think we've all been very patient.
You have.
Oh, and it hasn't been easy. First you go and get yourself all depressed. Then you lose your job. Oh, and to top it all, you try and kill yourself.
I was in a bad place.
Oh, and you think that wearing tights and calling yourself Michaela is going to help?
No. Well, yes, I mean, at least...
You know what? I could deal with all of that. I could. I'm your wife, after all. When I said my vows, I meant them. In sickness and in health, till death do us part. So I could take all of that. But not this. Look, Michael, you can't do this to me and the kids. Do you know what the sad thing is? No one will ever believe you're a woman. You'll never look like a woman. Never. I mean, you must know. You look like a freak. And maybe that's not what you want to hear, but you do. And if you go through with this, you'll still look like a freak. Just a freak without a dick. And you know that's not easy for me to say, but somebody's got to tell you the truth. You'll never pass for a woman. Shall I tell you why? You're too ugly for a start. You're too fat and you're too ugly. See what you made me say, Michael? You make me say things I don't want to.
I'm sorry.
And what do you think this makes me, Michael? Well, think about it. You're a woman. I'm a woman. So that makes me a lesbian. And Michael, I'm no lesbian.
I know.
And I want you to think about it very carefully before you go to this clinic. Because if you go through with this, if you continue to bring shame on this family, on the kids, I don't know how you can stand there and say that you love me or you love the kids, because this isn't love, Michael. This is you being selfish and only thinking of you. And I need you thinking of us, Michael. I need you to think seriously about what you're doing. Not just to me and the kids, but to this whole family. And now I'm late.
I'm sorry.
Then prove it, Michael. Ring the doctor and put a stop to this once and for all.
So, how did you get on? We wonder, how comfortable and confident would you feel asking these questions with an LGBT plus survivor? Also, what support do you need in order to feel more equipped to use the LGBT risk assessment and embed it as a standard practice in your service? Next, we ask you to pause this training and answer this question. True or false? To access a women's refuge, a trans woman must have undergone gender confirmation surgery. The answer is false. On the topic of single-sex exemptions and trans inclusion, the Equality and Human Rights Commission states that service providers can provide a different service or exclude a trans person, but this will only be lawful where the exclusion is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. Any exception to the prohibition of discrimination must be applied as restrictively as possible, and the denial of a service to a transgender person should only occur in exceptional circumstances. The provider will need to show that a less discriminatory way to achieve the objective was not available. For this next activity, we will take you through a step-by-step process of supporting an LGBT plus survivor. We hope this encourages you to think outside the box, recognise where biases may be present, and identify ways in which support for LGBT plus survivors may need an inclusive, directed approach. Our first question we'd like you to answer is, what assumptions may you make when taking a self-referral? And why might it be important to challenge these assumptions? When taking a self-referral, some presumptions you may make may include assuming a survivor's gender based on the sound of their voice. If you receive a self-referral over the phone and the person ringing has a deep voice, for example, this may lead you to automatically assume your service is not for them, or assume that the person calling may be a perpetrator. You may assume the survivor's pronouns. This is often an instant red flag for survivors. Introducing yourself with your pronouns and asking a survivor if they feel comfortable to share theirs is a great way of indicating to a survivor that you have a level of understanding around LGBT plus experiences. You may assume their abuser's gender. Make sure you are being considerate of pronouns assuming the gender of the abuser could prevent the survivor feeling safe enough to come out. Similarly, something to consider is whether or not the person's current relationship status is reflective of their identity. For example, you may be supporting a woman whose abuser is male, but this doesn't mean that their sexual orientation is heterosexual. It's important that you don't skip questions like this on referral forms based on an assumption, as to assume a survivor's sexual orientation could also make them feel unsafe and prevent them from coming out. This will later prevent you from identifying any additional risks or vulnerabilities based on their would-be answers. It's important to recognise how these assumptions can create instant barriers for survivors upon entering a service. When assessing the risk of an LGBT+ survivor, what additional things might you consider, or how may you change your practice? When assessing the risk of an LGBT+ survivor, it's important to remember to complete the LGBT+ Special Considerations Risk Assessment alongside the DASH Risk Assessment. Ensure that any additional risks identified are being explained when deeming whether the case is standard or high risk, and ensure you submit the LGBT+ risk assessment to MARAC. At MARAC, make sure that the MARAC chairs have the LGBT+ risk assessment before them. Ask for specialist support to be present and identify if any additional services need specialist input in order to accurately support an LGBT survivor. You may feel that you yourself need to go away and do some additional learning. We actively encourage identifying the gaps in your knowledge and seeking support around these areas. Do you need additional training on chemsex, for example, or do you need to go away and understand what demisexual means, perhaps? So, you've received a referral and you've completed a risk assessment and a needs assessment with the survivor. Together, you identified a need for safe accommodation. What difficulties may you face in securing emergency accommodation for an LGBT survivor? Some difficulties you may find when sourcing safe accommodation for an LGBT+ survivor may include having to advocate harder for a survivor's rights to safe accommodation. This may be particularly relevant when supporting a trans woman to access women-only housing, as you may have to advocate against single-sex exemptions that some providers may have instated. You may have to navigate questions of safety and visibility. Is the survivor out in all settings? Do they feel comfortable coming out in the supported accommodation, or would they have to hide their identity in order to feel safe? Is the survivor cis-passing, or are they at risk of being bullied and harassed by other survivors? What policies do the support accommodations have in place in case of events like these? And if you don't trust the safety of an accommodation, what other options could you explore? You have successfully managed to house the survivor in accommodation that is safe, culturally competent and LGBT inclusive. When making a safety plan, what additional things must you consider? To ensure your safety planning is considering LGBT+ needs, it must include things like an awareness of online and app safety. Does the survivor know how to keep themselves safe on dating apps? Do they know how to turn their locations off so that they're not tracked by their abuser? Do they have all their medications with them? This could include medications for mental health or additional needs, or it could include HRTs, hormone replacement therapies. Do they know where their local GP and pharmacies are in their new location? And do they know how to access treatments from their new home? Do they have all their documents that they need? This is particularly relevant if they have legally changed their gender or their name. As we approach the end of this webinar, we'd like you to pause this slide and do a final activity. Pause this webinar and jot down 2 actions that you would like to make in order to ensure your practice is committing to LGBT+ inclusion. We recommend choosing goals that feel achievable and set yourself a deadline of when to achieve these by. So, we recognise that this webinar has provided a brief introduction to LGBT+ experiences of domestic abuse, and it may have highlighted gaps in your learning and given you pause for thought. If you would like to learn more about LGBT plus experiences of abuse and how to ensure you are embedding LGBT plus inclusion in your work as domestic abuse practitioners, we recommend starting with these 3 resources. Thank you for joining us on this learning journey.